Dylan's still not feeling well, and I was supposed to get that live stream started tonight, and I didn't make it back there to get that going. So Dale's picking up my slack tonight. I appreciate that. All right, let's dig in here. Let's turn to 1 Samuel 26. What I've done here for us is tried to outline and kind of a survey of the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. Now, there's been times when we've slowed down and really dug in certain places here, but we're not going to be able to do that and cover all the material that we need to cover. So what this last sheet does for us is kind of outlines, surveys the last few chapters of 1 Samuel. And yes, and when we get to the end of this book of 1 Samuel, we're going to see the end of Saul. Okay, so Saul's been this first main character in this study of the monarchy. Saul being the first king of Israel, David being the second, and then David's son Solomon. But we're about to come to the end, the tragic end of King Saul. But let's look here at number 1, this first chapter, chapter 26. David spares Saul a second time. You remember a few chapters earlier, David had an opportunity to take his life in the cave. What did David do? Cut off a piece of his robe, said, Saul, look, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Well, Saul says, I'm sorry, David shouldn't have treated you like that. But here again we read of Saul doing the same thing, wanting to kill David again. But let's look here, the first 2 verses in chapter 26. It says, the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, said, look, is David not hiding in the hill of Hachilah, opposite Jeshimon? Verse 2 says that Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. It seems like every time Saul repents, it doesn't last very long. Hey, we can be guilty too, right? To have kind of a change of mind, and then we're doing good, and then, we turn again the wrong way. That's definitely what Saul did. Multiple times here. And so we see Saul's incited against David again. Look, here's David. Why don't you go get him? And Saul takes 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness. Do you think he's serious about taking David's life? Scroll down to verse 7. David has another chance to kill Saul. He comes into the camp. They figure out where Saul and his army are camped, and him and David, one of his comrades, comes there and has an opportunity to sneak up on Saul and take his life. Let's see what he does. Verse 7 it says, so David and Abishai came to the people by night, that is Saul and his army. And there Saul lay sleeping within the camp with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. And Abner, that is the commander of Saul's army, and the people lay all around him. Now look at verse 8. It says, Abishai said to David, God has delivered your enemy into your hand this day. Now therefore, please let me strike him at once with the spear right to the earth, and I will not have to strike him a second time. So the first shot's going to do it, he says. Verse 9 says, but David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? That's a good verse to put a star next to if you like to do that sort of thing. David said furthermore, as the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his days shall come to die, or he shall go out to battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But please take now the spear and the jug of water that are by his head, and let us go. So David took the spear and the jug of water by Saul's head, and they got away, and no man saw or knew it or awoke, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. So David, if you picture this, David and his friend here are creeping in by night into this encamped army, while they're asleep. You imagine probably maybe their heart rate got up a little bit, a little nervous, behind enemy lines sort of thing, But he has this opportunity. There lays Saul asleep. There's his spear, but David refuses. He said, look, here's your chance, David. This guy that's been out trying to kill you. But David refuses to take his life. So my first discussion point here is, what's David's reasoning behind sparing his enemy? And it's in the text. Yeah, this is God's anointed. Okay, verse 9. Who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? We've talked about that term anointed in this study. The idea is that he's God's chosen. Okay? Same terminology that we use, to refer to Jesus. Jesus the what? Starts with a C. Jesus Christ. Okay? Which means anointed one. He is God's chosen. Okay? So David has respect here for Saul because, God has put him in power. It's God's choice to put Saul in this position. And something else, though, that's not all. What else does he say there in verse 10? David said, furthermore, as the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him. Or his day shall come to die, or he shall go out to battle and perish. What's David saying? God's going to take care of this guy. It's not my job. The Lord said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And we've seen that throughout this study, right? As we've studied David in these last few chapters, these times that David has the opportunity to avenge himself, he puts it in God's hands. And I really think a key theme in this study and in this book of 1 Samuel is, friends, the sovereignty of God. And we use that phrase, but it's important. God has the ability to, accomplish his will and his purpose in this world, right? And hey, if he sees fit to punish someone in an earthly, temporal way, then he'll take care of that. God will take care of that. We don't have to worry about doing the Lord's job for him. I think that's what David said. Look, David's going to let God take care of it. Certainly a point for us to remember today. But if you scroll down here in this chapter, verses 23 and 24, we really see in David an attitude of reverence for God and trust in him. So Saul and David, again, have another conversation, again, just like they did after the incident in the cave. David says, again, look, Saul's, could have killed you. And then verse 23, now listen to what David says there. He says, may the Lord repay every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. David knew that the Lord would regard his righteousness and his right doing, and that the Lord would respect him and reward him for doing that. He says, for the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I would not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. David's saying, I did what was right here. And indeed, verse 24, as your life was valued much this day in my eyes, so let my life be valued much in the eyes of the Lord, and let him deliver me out of all tribulation. David understood the power of God. David understood that, look, it's not in me or my sword that's going to, deliver me from evil. Ultimately, who's in charge? Well, it's the good Lord, right? He's going to protect me from this evil man, and the Lord certainly did just that. But that's chapter 26. Kind of a short version there, but David spares Saul a second time. Any comments there? This next chapter is interesting. It's not the first time that David flees to Philistine territory. So David, you see number 2 here on your handout, David flees to Gath. This is a city in Philistine territory. Now, why is that significant? Who are the Philistines in David's day, by the way? Yeah, who was Goliath? He was a Philistine, right? So the Philistines are Israel's enemy. But David flees here to Philistine territory to get away from Saul. Verse 1 of chapter 27. David said in his heart, he said, look, I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. And Saul will despair of me to seek me any more in any part of Israel. So I shall escape out of his hand. Although David, trusted in God's power, to deliver him, yet David still had to do his part, and David still tried to use his common sense and say, I'm get away from this guy. So there was still, that element of it is, still having to do what he needed to do to keep himself safe, although ultimately under the protection of God. But look at my discussion question here, and we're kind of going to get into this, but why does David think that Philistine territory is going to be a good place for him? And that's a question that I had in my mind as I was reading this. You think about the Philistines, all right, these are Israel's enemies. David, an Israelite, by the way, killed the champion Goliath, who was a Philistine. What do you think the Philistines think about David? And all of a sudden now David's wanting to thinking that he's going to find safety in Philistine territory with this Philistine king. That kind of baffled me. What about you? Yeah, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. But when we get to thinking about it, again, my question here is how is he able to dwell safely in the land of Israel's enemies? Well, because of Saul's enmity, because of Saul's hatred of David, David has become Saul's enemy, right? Okay. So if David is an enemy of Saul now, because of Saul's hatred, well then we could see where he might get along with some of the other enemies of Saul. Isn't that how it works? You become an enemy of somebody, and then, because of that relationship, you might buddy up with somebody else who's also an enemy of that guy. Yeah. So I think we can kind of see now how is David going to even survive over here in Philistine territory? Well, he's become an enemy of Saul now, and I guess the Philistines can see that or have knowledge of this. But also something else we see in chapter 27 is, by the way, does David have anything to offer? Is David by himself, or has he got a following with him? Got some men with him, right? So when you got these big, strong, mighty fighting men with you, you say, hey, we got something to offer, okay? 600, valiant men. He can go over here in Philistine territory and say, look, we want to camp out over here. Okay, we'll let you, but you got to do us some favors. I want you to go out and fight some battles for us and, fight some of our enemies for us. And that's kind of the sort of thing that goes on here. So it seems to me that David, because of, he's an enemy of Saul now, and he's got these men with him, he can offer service to this Philistine king. So, that relationship was able to form there between David and this Philistine king. But David kind of practiced some deception here, and we're gonna read about that. It's possible, Lisa. It is. Maybe seeing, saw in David, some divine help of some sort. Now we know the Philistines were idolaters. They were, had belief in multiple gods, but that, they could have respected whatever God they thought was helping. This guy's got some divine help of some sort. I think that's totally possible. Yeah. So I have some more questions too. It's like, how did this relationship, form? But I think all of what we've said here kind of explains that. So, but that's good. That's good. It's good to think through these things. But let's look at verse 8, because there's some deception that's going on here in chapter 27. And beginning there in verse 8, it says that David and his men, so David had already set up shop there in Philistine territory, and he's kind of sheltered, there with the king of the Philistines. But it says in verse 8 that David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. For those nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. So David and his men are making these military raids, but they're attacking, Canaanite people, the Amalekites. Those are the enemies of Israel, right? But now, you keep reading here now look at verse 9. It says, whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. And Achish would say, David, where have you made a raid today? And David said, we've been against the southern area of Judah, or the southern area of the Jerahmeelites, or against the southern area of the Kenites. In verse 11, David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, thus David did. And thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So look at verse 12. So Achish believed David, saying, he has made his people Israel utterly abhor him, and therefore he will be my servant forever. What's going on here? How did David deceive the Philistine king? Do you see what's going on here? Yeah, he was. So David is, again, he's kind of sheltered here with the Philistines, and he's kind of acting like, look, Philistine king, I'm going to help you. I'm going to go fight Israel for you. Oh, great. But then when David actually and his men go out to battle, they're not going to fight their fellow Israelites. They're going to fight the enemies of the Israelites. Okay, you see back in verse 8. And so when David and his men come home, Achish saying, well, who'd you go beat up for me today? Oh, well, we went and, killed these guys and these guys for you. We're fighting your battles for you. Oh, well, thank you, David. Well, in reality, David wasn't doing that. David was taking care of Israel's enemies, not the Philistines. So David is practicing some extreme deception here, it seems. So the answer to the question there is he made the king think he was fighting Israel, but he was really fighting Israel's enemies. So he made the king think that he was fighting with Israel, but he was not. So it's all part of David's strategy to keep himself safe while he's fleeing from Saul, but at the same time doing the Lord's work. They're going out and fighting these enemies of Israel and doing some work that should have already been done. But that's an interesting chapter there, chapter 27. Now, let's get into chapter 28. We got 10 minutes. This is an interesting chapter. Very, very interesting. And I have number 3 here. This is the prophecy of Saul's death. So just kind of, we don't have to read all the text here, but just looking at the outline. So the Philistines are preparing to fight against Israel. Okay, so the Philistines are saddling up. They're ready to come against Israel. Saul is afraid. Verse 5. He's not sure how this is going to go. And verse 6, he's going to the Lord, and then the Lord's not answering him. By the way, why is that? Why is the Lord? It's verse 6, it says, Saul inquired of the Lord. The Lord would not answer him. Why? Has Saul been this faithful, trusting servant of the Lord? No. So certainly I think we're right to conclude that it's because of Saul's sin and Saul's disobedience. Saul's out trying to kill David, and Saul's, has this long history of disobedience in his reign as king. The Lord's not answered him. The Lord has left him. Okay? He doesn't have the favor of the Lord because of his own disobedience. And Saul consults, verses 7 through 11 here. The New King James says a medium. Let's read verse 7. So Saul doesn't get an answer from the Lord. So verse 7, Saul said to his servants, find me a woman who is a medium. Now the King James may say, I believe says, a woman that hath a familiar spirit. Is that right? Okay. So the New King James says a medium, and we'll define that here in just a second. That I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, in fact, there's a woman who is a medium at Endor. You may have read an article or something about the witch of Endor. Okay, I don't think the term witch is used, but we refer to this little incident of this witch at Endor. Kind of interesting. So verse 8, it says, Saul disguises himself and put on other clothes, and he went and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. He said, please conduct a seance for me, and bring up for me the one I shall name to you. What's Saul wanting to do here? And some of you may know the rest of the story, but wanting to bring up somebody from the dead. Yeah, Samuel. Verse 9, then the woman said to him, look, you know what Saul has done. Saul had disguised himself, right? He said, look, Saul has already cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why then did you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Verse 11 says, then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. Saul is wanting this woman to bring up Samuel from the dead. Good idea or bad idea? Probably not a good idea. Okay, we'll get into that just a little bit later. But let's go ahead and define this woman here. The New King James has medium. The King James, a woman that hath a familiar spirit. I believe from the little I've read on this, the Hebrew word there, I think it's kind of disputed as to the exact meaning, but the idea here of this medium, or however you want to define this person, or however you want to, whatever label you want to put on this person, this was a person who professed ability to communicate with the dead. Okay? And you'll see this term necromancer. I think maybe some other translations use that particular word. That's in Webster's dictionary. Someone who tries to communicate with the dead. Okay? By the way, the law of Moses, if you go to Deuteronomy 18, the law of Moses condemned this sort of thing. Okay? You look at Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 and following there. The Lord, puts all of these, this sorcery, witchcraft, all these people who are trying to communicate with the dead, He puts all of them in one big category and says, this is an abomination. Okay? I know that even today there's this sort of thing, people are trying to do the same sort of thing, right? You hear of, when I was growing up, the thing was a Ouija board. I don't know what a Ouija board is, but it was something about where people thought they could play with that thing and start communicating with the dead. Look, I don't even want to mess with that sort of thing, okay? Yeah, there's a lot of people who profess such ability to do that, right? And as we can see right here in the Old Testament, that sort of thing, God does not speak very highly of it. But let's just read this here. We got just a couple minutes. Let's see what happens here, because it's interesting. So you want you to bring up Samuel. By the way, why does she want to bring up Samuel? Well, Samuel had passed away, right? We read about that a few chapters earlier. Samuel was the prophet who had appointed and anointed Saul. Saul wants an answer. What do I do? He's in a hard time right now, right? He's worried about what's going to happen. Now in verse 12 it says, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. And the king said to her, do not be afraid. What did you see? The woman said to Saul, I saw a spirit descending out of the earth. So he said to her, what is his form? She said, it's an old man is coming up, and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Now verse 15 says, now Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Now just stop right there for just a second. This is kind of where the debate is. People look at this and they say, did this woman really have ability to bring up the dead and bring up the spirit of the dead and communicate? Did the woman have this ability to do this? And I was doing a little reading on that, and I think it's kind of the camp where I'm falling into as well, that I don't believe this woman in and of herself had the power to do this. I believe God allowed it to happen. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? The woman just didn't have this, that she could, I think this woman was a fake. But I think because of the situation here, it was God's will that the spirit of Samuel communicate with Saul. I believe it was God's will that should happen. And I think we certainly see Samuel. Verse 15 says, Samuel said to Saul. Did Samuel speak? Did the spirit of Samuel speak? It appears so here from the Bible. Okay, and some people will debate that. They say, can't figure this out. But and I'll read you. I've got a quote here from Wayne Jackson in our little handout, which I think is a good one. He says, it's probably safe to say that a majority of Old Testament students believe that in this unusual episode, something actually happened that the woman of Endor did not anticipate. Okay? Look at verse 12. It says, when the woman saw Samuel, what did she do? Cried out with a loud voice. This scared her. Okay? Yeah, she screamed. Yeah. So it seems, I think we're right to conclude that this woman didn't expect to actually be successful in what she was saying that she had the ability to do. Yeah. But we're about to run out of time, but let me just show you verse 19. And this would be a good place to stop. And I know it's taken a while to get through this material, but we're going through a lot of material, but we're going to read all of what Samuel says next time, but I want you to look at verse 19. He says, moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. That's not good, is it? It's not good for Saul. Okay. So we'll leave it at that tonight. I appreciate your attention, and we'll finish this next time. Yes. No, go ahead. I know Miss Brenda. Broken bone in her leg. Well, that's, and Hal's not doing good.
Hal's not doing good. He was on the list for the lung transplant. He decided not to do that. He said he was just going to live rest of his life. He can still live, but he would do better if he had another lung, probably. That's it. Yeah, well, anytime
That's tough on you.
But, find out about that, and then my cousin's wife died, and of course they lived down south all the time.
So this Kathleen was your cousin's wife.
My cousin's wife, she was my mother's nephew's wife.
Well, I appreciate you letting me know all that.
Well, I don't know if you probably know Christine Hopeline. She lived in Savannah. That's where Mama was born and raised.
I don't think of it.
Mabel and Christine and Mama and G.W. G.W. He's still natural. He's still going fishing up there. He's 90-something years old. He's 92 or 93. Still goes fishing.
Still going strong. I'd want to do it too. I hope I'll be able to do it.
He's a fine man.
Yeah.
He's one of them straight shooters. He tells you like it is.
That's the way it should be.
I like him that way.
I understand. Huh? How are you? You doing good? You had a good time in Bible class? All right. Good. His dad's still upstairs, I think. Where's Dad? Where's Dad? I think we got everybody here now. We're ready to rock and roll here this evening. We've had a good study together up here. Hope that your classes went well also, and it's been good to be with you today, this evening. Just a couple announcements here before we begin to close. Brother Dylan Sharp is still not feeling well, and hopefully he'll be on the mend soon, but he told me today that he's still under the weather, so I want to inform you about Brother Dylan. Of course, the funeral for Stanley's father was today in Red Bay. Keep this family in your prayers. Miss Mary Ethel is doing well after her hip surgery. She's got some recovery ahead of her, but she's a tough one. She's a tough one. So, but pray for Mary Ethel and her recovery. Brother Dale's here tonight. Glad that he's feeling better. Thankful for that. Miss Clarice, of course, a member of our family, should be going home from rehab Friday, so she's excited about that. Brother Harold told me about Miss Kathleen Holt, the passing of Miss Kathleen. This was Harold's cousin's wife. The Holt family is in need of our prayers. And Miss Laura Gargis, a lot of you know Miss Laura, is in Vanderbilt Hospital and will have surgery tomorrow to remove a brain tumor tomorrow. So both Hal and Laura, of course, need our prayers. And Brenda Grigsby suffered a broken bone in her leg. Brother Harold told me about her as well today. So long list of those who are in need of prayers at this time, but any of you have any additions to those? Remember all of those, please. Let me just share something with you. A passage that I came across in my reading this week that just was special to me. We've all read it before. Maybe I've just not paid as much attention to it as I should. But in John 17 and verse 24, in John 17, Jesus is praying to his heavenly Father. He's about to be crucified. He's about to be taken. He's about to be crucified. He knows where he's going. Some people call this prayer in John 17 the high priestly prayer of Jesus. Just a special prayer. He prays for his disciples. He prays for us, by the way, those who believe through the word of his disciples. But just a beautiful statement in verse 24 where Jesus says, he says, Father, I desire that they also whom you gave me may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory which you have given me, for you love me before the foundation of the world. Boy, now that is a special passage. Jesus says, I desire that my disciples, Jesus says, those whom, Father, you have given me, I desire that they may be with me where I am and may behold my glory which you have given me. You think about that. We sing that song, We Shall See the King Someday. Well, that's what Jesus is saying there, isn't it? That they may behold my glory which you've given me. Jesus wants us to be with him one day. I think the question is for us, is that where we want to be? Are we living our lives? Are we on that road that leads to, yes, that final entrance into those gates and see the King and live with him for all eternity in his glory, in his heavenly glory? If there's someone here this evening, we can encourage you through prayer. We want to give you the opportunity to make your need known if that is your need tonight. Maybe there's someone here who needs to obey the gospel, to believe with all your heart, repent of sin, confess your faith, and be baptized, have your sins forgiven. We can assist you with that. But if someone has a need tonight, we want to assist you. We want to bless you. If you have a need, why don't you come as together we stand and sing. Nailed to the cross, is thy heart right with God?
Dost thou count all things for Jesus but loss? Is thy heart right crimson flood, cleansed and made holy, humble and lowly, right in the sight of God. Are all thy powers under Jesus' control? Is thy heart right with God? Does each moment abide in thy soul? Is thy heart right with God? Is thy heart right with God? Washed in the crimson flood, cleansed and made holy, humble and lowly, right in the sight of God.
Amen. It's been a joy to be with you this evening. Hope you all have